On Sunday, September 9th, 1984, Dave and Sandy Lutkin sat down for lunch with some friends at a pizza place in the small, tight-knit community of The Dalles, Oregon. Dave looked around at the bustling restaurant, and then he looked over at his wife and smiled. They owned the place. It was a franchise of the Shakey's Pizza Parlor chain, and he and his wife were clearly thrilled to see so many people stopping by to eat after Sunday church services. Business was actually going so well that Dave and Sandy were thinking about opening up another location in nearby Hood River. But it was Dave's day off today, and he didn't want to think about work. Between raising kids and running the restaurant, he didn't get much time to just hang out and catch up with friends. And so Dave turned back to the two friends at the table with he and his wife, and they were a married couple named Dan and Kay, and Dave asked them, how are things going? Now, Dave knew that Dan was very active in local politics, and therefore kind of knew all the latest town gossip. And so really that's what Dave was asking Dan, like, hey, what's going on in town? What have you heard? And so after asking this question, Dave began to eat his macaroni salad, as Dan very enthusiastically began to fill them in on what was happening behind the scenes in the Dalles. There was a debate about tearing down an old school that they had attended as kids, and there were also some plans to renovate a nearby park, but the big news was local officials were still clashing with a religious commune that had recently bought a ranch on the outskirts of town. And the people in this town were complaining that some of these commune members dressed very funny and they smelled weird, like they could be homeless or something. And worse yet, according to the townspeople, this commune had apparently bussed in actual homeless people from around the country and then registered them to vote. And so as Dan was talking about this, he couldn't help himself and just shook his head and said, what would happen if these weirdos from the commune took over? As Dave listened, he thought about his own experience with this commune. He actually didn't have any complaints about them. In fact, sometimes a few of them would venture into town and come to Shakey's to eat, which was great for Dave and Sandy, and they never caused any problems and they always paid for their food, so really Dave had no complaints. And so Dan continued chatting for a bit longer about the commune and about some other topics around town, and then eventually they all finished eating their lunch and they stood up and said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. Later that day, Dave was standing behind the cash register inside of their restaurant, counting out the day's profits. And as he did that, suddenly a cramp stabbed at his stomach so hard that he had to bend over. He tried to breathe through the spasm, but it only seemed to get worse, and then also he was hit with a wave of nausea. Dave knew Sandy was outside in the car waiting for him, and so he pushed through the pain and finished at the register, and then he went to the doors, walked outside, locked up behind him, and made his way over to the car. Once he was inside, he told Sandy about this pain he had, and he told her he felt nauseous, and he said, I just gotta get home. And so Dave drove as fast as he could back to their house, trying to keep the nausea at bay, and as soon as they pulled into the driveway, Dave hopped out, ran inside the house, ran into the bathroom, locked it behind him, and then he just began vomiting practically nonstop into the toilet. A minute later, Dave heard Sandy knocking furiously at the door, and Dave grabbed onto the bathroom sink to kind of pull himself back to his feet, and he reached over and unlocked the door. Dave thought his wife was knocking because she was worried about him, but no, as soon as the door opened, she just rushed past Dave and took his spot at the toilet and began retching into the bowl too. Dave figured they must have caught some sort of stomach bug and just needed to rest. But when he tried to walk to their bedroom, he became so dizzy he almost fell over. So he just sat on the ground waiting for his wife to finish in the bathroom. And as he waited, Dave put a hand to his forehead and felt how hot he was getting. His body became slick with sweat as chills ran down his body, and his stomach began to cramp up again very painfully. And then when Sandy finally emerged, Dave felt nauseous again, and so he rushed back inside and began vomiting. And then every time he was done vomiting, he would have these horrible bouts of diarrhea. And so when Dave came out of the bathroom the second time, he found Sandy lying on the bed. She was pale and there was sweat running down her face, and she started saying something to him, but when she spoke, her words were slurred and unsteady. At this point, Dave was really beginning to worry. It seemed like they both might not just have a stomach bug, that this might be something kind of serious and they might need medical attention. But at the same time, Dave wasn't sure he could even drive them to the hospital with how he was feeling. And so Dave just climbed onto the bed next to his wife, and the two of them just laid there for several hours, hoping that whatever was going on with them might begin to taper off. But after several hours, Dave was still feeling incredibly weak and horrible. And so at this point, Dave decided they couldn't wait any longer to get help. He knew that he and Sandy were now so dehydrated that he was worried they could pass out or something. So Dave got out of the bed and stumbled to the kitchen and called a taxi. 10 minutes later, he and Sandy were in that taxi on the way to the emergency room. After a short ride, Dave walked inside of the emergency department with Sandy leaning on his arm for support. To Dave's surprise, the waiting room was already completely packed. And right away, he spotted a few people who had eaten at his restaurant earlier that day, and all of them looked pale and sweaty just like he and his wife. Dave and Sandy limped over to the check-in counter and nearly bumped into their friend, Dan, who looked even worse than Dave and Sandy. The trio sat together as they waited, but nobody said anything. They all felt too sick to talk. Eventually, Dave and Sandy were admitted to the hospital, and a nurse hooked them up to IV drips to replenish all the fluids they'd lost. Then, the doctor explained that the couple was too sick to go home, and they would need to stay overnight for observation, or at least until they figured out what was making them so sick. And so after Dave and Sandy were set up in their room, a doctor said a nurse would come by soon to collect blood and stool samples shortly. The next morning, the doctor returned to Dave and Sandy's hospital room and told them he had their test results. Dave listened intently as she explained that he and Sandy had salmonella poisoning, a bacterial infection that attacks the intestinal tract. And in fact, the doctor said the majority of the other people who had come in the previous day, along with Dave and Sandy, they also had salmonella poisoning. Now, the doctor said they didn't know where the salmonella had come from, but immediately Dave had a bad feeling. He didn't dare say it out loud, not even to Sandy, but secretly, he worried the salmonella poisoning had come from their restaurant. Dave grappled with that horrible thought as he and Sandy were discharged and began to make their way back through the hospital towards the exit. And as they got near the exit, they saw there was still a crowd of patients waiting to be seen, which actually made the waiting room seem even busier than it had been the night before. Dave guided Sandy to the door, feeling very grateful to be getting out of the hospital, but also feeling very guilty that his restaurant might very well be to blame for this outbreak. Later that day, Oregon State epidemiologist Dr. Lawrence Foster picked up the ringing phone on his desk. An epidemiologist is someone who investigates patterns and causes of disease and injury. Dr. Foster was a quiet man with a gentle demeanor who operated extremely well under pressure, responding to emergencies with science and logic. He actually loved the intense work of being an epidemiologist and listened closely as an official on the phone outlined a new breaking case. In the past 24 hours, nearly 20 patients had arrived all at once at a small hospital near the Dalles, Oregon. All of them had been diagnosed with salmonella poisoning, and almost all of them had eaten at a local pizza place right before getting salmonella poisoning. Dr. Foster thanked the official for calling with the update and said he would get right on it. After hanging up the phone, Dr. Foster did not think this was some crazy crisis. Instead, he thought this was a pretty straightforward case of food poisoning, and so now his job was to locate the source of the salmonella bacteria and eliminate it. So he grabbed his car keys and headed for the door. He knew where to start looking. About an hour later, Dr. Foster pulled up to Shakey's Pizza Parlor in the Dalles. It looked like an old-school pizza joint with a large hand-painted sign and Adirondack chairs out front. The restaurant was closed for the day, but the doctor had picked up the keys from Dave Lutkins, one of the owners, on the way over. After opening the door, Dr. Foster stepped inside and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The first step to pinpointing the exact source of the salmonella outbreak was to gather food samples and then take them back to the lab to be tested. And so that's what Dr. Foster was here to do, get those samples. And then while the food testing was underway, members of Dr. Foster's team would interview the restaurant's employees, while others would talk to the patients at the hospital who had fallen ill. And so Dr. Foster began walking around the empty restaurant, stopping periodically to look closer at table surfaces and kitchen equipment and whatever else he could see. And then eventually he walked over to the large walk-in refrigerator. And when he poked his head inside, He saw there were rows of plastic containers holding the restaurant's salad bar offerings. Fresh veggies, several kinds of lettuce, garnishes, and dressings. And right away, Dr. Foster felt like this very likely could be where the salmonella came from. He knew from experience that the raw ingredients on an open-air salad bar were a very common source of food poisoning. And so Dr. Foster worked his way through the walk-in fridge, carefully plucking out samples of each food item using sanitized tweezers and placing them all in the small plastic containers that he'd brought along. By the time he left the restaurant, Dr. Foster was certain the samples he had taken would crack the case in no time. Later that week, Dave Lutkin sat in a corner booth at Shakey's, dejectedly staring out the window. He and Sandy had been sick for days, but he was feeling better and the delirium had finally gone away. However, coming back to his senses was no picnic. Even though he had deep cleaned and reopened his restaurant and had shut down his salad bar just in case, word was all over the news that their restaurant, Shakey's, had very likely caused the big Salmonella outbreak. And so as a result, Dave and his wife had not seen a single customer all day, or all week for that matter. Dave let out a sigh as he thought about all the money they were losing, but even worse than that, 13 of his employees were still sick, and dozens of his regular customers had fallen ill and were still dealing with symptoms. Suddenly, the ring of a telephone pulled Dave away from his negative, spiraling thoughts, and so he rushed to the counter, hopeful whoever was calling was a customer, maybe looking to place a takeout order. And so he brought the receiver to his ear, and the second it was against his ear, he quickly had to pull it away, because on the other line was a man who'd gotten sick after eating at Shakey's, and he was screaming at Dave through the phone, threatening to sue him. And so Dave just sat there listening as this guy accused him of feeding his customers dirty produce. Dave had gotten dozens of calls just like that one, and he was starting to worry that they would never end. Once the yelling man had said his piece and hung up, Dave walked back to the booth, shoulders slumped. Then he turned back to the window and went back to scanning the streets for customers he knew would never come. A week later, Dr. Foster sat in his office with his head in his hands. He'd been so sure that this outbreak of food poisoning was due to contaminated ingredients at Shakey's Pizza that he really hadn't even considered if that wasn't it. It just seemed so likely. But now he knew he was incorrect. That had not been the source, because he'd just gotten word that there were an additional 20 cases of salmonella poisoning from people who ate at 2 other restaurants in town. So Shakey's could not be the only source of the bacteria that was making these people sick. Dr. Foster was confident in his abilities, but he also knew when to admit that he had been wrong. And he definitely underestimated the severity of this salmonella outbreak. It was way bigger than just Shakey's. In fact, he was receiving daily calls from the Dow's emergency room begging him for updates as the number of salmonella cases surged towards 100. And so far, Dr. Foster didn't have any answers. And so he stood up from his chair and began pacing around his office. He couldn't just sit around and wait all day. With all the new cases popping up, maybe his team just needed to expand their investigation. 30 minutes later, Dr. Foster, along with his team, sat around a large table in the conference room. He did his best to stay calm and collected, but truthfully, he was starting to feel nervous. He told his team that all they knew for sure right now was that all these people who got sick had gotten sick after eating at 3 different restaurants, all in the Dalles. And then after saying that, he opened up the floor to discussion. He basically wanted people to come up with more ideas about where the salmonella outbreak could be coming from. And so after going back and forth for a few minutes, kind of rehashing the same details everybody knew, one scientist who'd been quiet during the entire discussion so far suddenly spoke up. He wondered if maybe the salmonella could have somehow entered the town's water supply. If the bacteria was in the water supply, then it kind of made sense that it was now being found in multiple locations. Dr. Foster considered the alarming implications of this possibility. If the salmonella was coming from the water supply, there was no telling how much bigger this outbreak would get. Dr. Foster told the scientists to gather his things. They were going to go to the Dalles to check their water. The next day, Dr. Michael Skeels leaned over a lab bench in his laboratory at the Oregon State Public Health Lab near Portland. Like his colleague, Dr. Foster, Dr. Skeels had been working around the clock to try to figure out the source of the Salmonella outbreak in the Dales, examining dozens of samples every day. Dr. Skeels adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses on the bridge of his nose, willing his tired eyes to stay open as he screened yet another petri dish with bacteria grown from a lettuce sample. Unsurprisingly, it seemed to be teeming with Salmonella bacteria. But there was something odd about all the bacteria they kept finding. There were 2,500 different strains of Salmonella that Dr. Skeels knew of, but they kept finding the exact same very rare strain over and over again. Dr. Skeels reasoned that this meant that all of the Salmonella had almost certainly come from one source, but he had no idea what the source could be. Dr. Skeels knew one thing for sure, though. It was not the water supply. His staff had tested the public water samples Dr. Foster's team had collected, and they had found no bacteria in the water. It was totally clean. So the investigation was sort of back to square one. Dr. Skeels sighed as he lifted his head from the lab bench and looked around the room at his exhausted colleagues hunched over their work. He desperately needed more coffee, or even better, a nap. But that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Because not only was their investigation stalled, the public health crisis in the Dalles was only getting worse. Over the past few days, the number of restaurants involved in Salmonella poisonings had increased. Salmonella had now been found in 10 restaurants, and so now a second wave of infections was engulfing the town, and this time it was much bigger than the first. Dozens more people were sick, and more people were arriving at the hospital every hour. The scale of this second outbreak was overwhelming the town. Emergency rooms were struggling to manage the new patients, and all of the hospital beds were full and patients were sleeping in the hallways. And so, of course, the people who were getting sick were lashing out at the only people they could, the doctors and nurses, who were doing their best, but they were having a really hard time keeping up. It was just complete chaos. Dr. Skeels was struggling to keep up too. He was doing his best to manage all of the lab testing while also trying to figure out why this new outbreak was happening. It seemed like the Salmonella was showing up everywhere and yet still coming from nowhere. The bacteria kept being found where they expected it to be, mostly in salad bar vegetables like lettuce and cucumbers, but also they found it in items that are rarely contaminated with Salmonella, such as salad dressings and coffee creamers. And they still had no idea how so many different foods could be contaminated. It wasn't the water supply, so where was this bacteria coming from? Dr. Skeels waved his tired staff over to him in the middle of the lab. And as they walked over, he took in their bloodshot eyes and their stained lab coats, and he knew he looked just as bad as they did. Dr. Skeels took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. He told the group that the outbreak was getting way too big for this small staff. If they were going to find the source of this mass poisoning and prevent new cases, they needed help. It was now time for the federal government to step in, which meant they needed to contact the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short. His very tired team nodded in agreement, and so Dr. Skeels turned and headed to his office to make the call. A few days later, Dr. Skeels could barely contain his shock as he combed through the CDC's research. The CDC had put its enormous resources to good use, interviewing hundreds of patients as well as their families and friends. They spoke to 325 food handlers who had all worked at the 10 restaurants. They measured salad bar temperatures and investigated food handling practices. They even visited a few farms to inspect the milk and vegetables that these restaurants had used. And they discovered that people who had food that was delivered from these 10 restaurants did not get sick, but the people who actually physically ate inside of those 10 restaurants did get sick. They also discovered that while the blue cheese salad dressing at one of these salad bars was teeming with Salmonella, well, the powdered mix that makes that salad dressing contained no Salmonella. To Dr. Skeels, these were very revealing discoveries, because it meant that the food in these 10 restaurants was safe when it left the kitchen, like for a takeout order, but then somehow, once it was in the dining areas inside of these restaurants, it became contaminated. But it was hard for Dr. Skeels to even come up with an idea of how that could happen. He wondered, for example, how the powdered salad dressing mix could be clean while it was in storage and then suddenly turn poisonous when the staff prepared it for the salad bar. It just didn't make sense. But then Dr. Skeels had an alarming thought. What if someone was putting the salmonella in the dressing after it was prepared? Or putting the salmonella in the food once it was inside of the dining hall? I mean, if this was done by a person, then it all made sense. Dr. Skeels realized that he was imagining a possibility that seemed too far-fetched to be true. Did someone purposely grow toxic bacteria and then for some reason choose to release it into the community? The name for that was bioterrorism, but the question was, if it really was bioterrorism, which again was very far-fetched, who would want to do that? About a week later, Dr. Skeels sat in the conference room at the Oregon State Public Health Department, along with some of his senior scientists, to hear the latest update from the CDC officials. One of the CDC representatives began with the good news. The Salmonella outbreak had finally died down sort of on its own. Thankfully, no one had died, and there hadn't been any new cases for a week. But then Dr. Skeels heard the bad news. They still did not know what, or who, had caused the 2 waves of salmonella cases that sickened an incredible 700 people. But the more they'd learned about these outbreaks, the more everyone seemed to agree with Dr. Skeels. The whole fiasco did seem like a deliberate attack. They just couldn't prove it. The CDC said they were going to continue their investigation, but it seemed like for now, the crisis was over. Dr. Skeels was relieved to return to his usual work, but he felt haunted by the fact that he hadn't solved this mystery. A year later, on October 2nd, 1985, Dr. Skeels pulled his car to the side of a country road outside of the Dalles. His team was already there waiting for him. As he approached the group, Dr. Skeels felt the nerves and anticipation bubbling up all around him. But public health officials were not the only ones on the side of this lonely road. They were surrounded by federal agents carrying semi-automatic weapons and wearing bulletproof vests. This was a raid by federal agents, and Dr. Skeels felt very out of place. Now, this job, being a part of this raid, could not be more different than Dr. Skeels' usual stream of research and meetings, but he reminded himself that they needed him. If this raid was going to be a success, he needed to stay calm and focused and do his job. And so the leadership in charge of the raid finished running through the plan a few more times, and then everybody returned to their respective vehicles. Dr. Skeels drove behind the rest of the 50-person group as they entered through the gates of the 64,000-acre ranch that was the home of the Rajneeshi religious commune. Dr. Skeels headed straight for one unassuming building, search warrant in hand. He was accompanied by a germ warfare expert from Washington, D.C. The instant they stepped inside of that building, Dr. Skeels could not believe what he saw. It was a state-of-the-art medical laboratory that this commune was clearly running. Dr. Skeels walked around inspecting the various experiments and documents that were strewn about. At some point, he found a copy of the anarchist cookbook open to a certain page just laying out on the table. A chill ran down the doctor's spine as he flipped through the instructions on how to make homemade explosives and illegal drugs. Nearby, there was another book that focused on military biological warfare. The literature was fascinating and horrifying, but it was not what he was looking for. Dr. Skeels continued walking through the lab, making his way to a back corner where he found a large walk-in freezer. His eyes went wide as he took in the rows of rare chemicals and bacteria perched along the walls inside of glass vials. He walked to the back of the freezer and he leaned in close to see the contents, and his breath caught in his throat as he read the label closest to him. It said, Salmonella. Dr. Skeels carefully removed the glass vials and placed them in his bag for evidence. The answer to the poisoning of an entire town was right in front of him. Lab tests would prove that the salmonella samples Dr. Skeels collected inside of that lab were an exact match for the strain that was found in the Dalles a year earlier. The Rajneeshis had deliberately planted the salmonella at Shakey's Pizza Parlor and other restaurants in town, hoping to sicken as many people as possible. The Rajneeshis preached that they were leading the way to a new era of free love at their commune. However, they kept on getting into fights with the Wasco County Commission that regulated what they could and could not do at their commune. So the Rajneeshis had decided to just go ahead and take over the commission by installing their own candidates. The Rajneeshi leaders reasoned that if most local residents were too sick to vote, then their candidates could easily win. They used the months before the November vote for a bizarre kind of dress rehearsal. Initially, commune members had put salmonella in spray bottles and doused doors and other public places in the Dalles, but no one had gotten sick. So, in early September, they tried spraying salad bars in 10 local restaurants. For good measure, they also sprayed other items like the salad dressings and coffee creamers. And this attack did exactly what the commune leaders hoped for. Hundreds of people got sick. But amazingly, this was really only the start of the Rajneeshis' plot to win this election. They were going to poison people's food with salmonella, but also they did intend to poison the Dalles water supply with salmonella, and one of their members did get access to the water supply, but for some unknown reason, the plan failed, and so no one got sick from the water, and therefore not enough people got sick, and so enough people turned out to vote, and so the cult's candidates lost the election, despite having bussed in all those extra homeless people to vote for them. It just wasn't enough. And so after this raid, the Rajneeshis' leader, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and his deputy, Ma Anand Sheela, were both arrested. There was not enough evidence to prove Bhagwan was behind the attack. Instead, it seemed like Sheela had sort of acted on her own. And so she was tried and found guilty for the salmonella attack, and eventually served 29 months in prison before being deported to West Germany. As for the commune compound, it was shut down and the land was sold. Despite being vindicated, Dave and Sandy Lutkin's business, the pizza parlor, never recovered, and so they had to close it down. However, out of this, they were able to start a catering business instead, where they had much more control over who had access to their food. To this day, the Rajneeshi salad bar poisoning remains the single largest bioterrorism attack in United States history. It was another beautiful day in late October 1994. The afternoon air was cool and the sky above the town of Voorhees was a soft, clear blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. As 52-year-old Carol Nulander stepped out the door of Classic Cakes Bakery onto the sidewalk, she stopped for a minute and tilted her face upward to enjoy the feel of the light breeze and sunshine. With her eyes closed, she could forget for a few seconds that she was standing in a strip mall in northern New Jersey surrounded by parking lots, and that pretty soon she'd be joining the hundreds of other drivers on the crowded highway that led south from Voorhees to Carol's home in neighboring Cherry Hill. Carol let out her breath and opened her eyes. She and her husband, Rabbi Fred Nulander, did not actually mind the commercial sprawl that had spread out around them since they had arrived in Cherry Hill 20 years ago. That was when Fred had gotten his first job, as assistant rabbi at a Jewish synagogue in Cherry Hill named Emmanuel Temple. A rabbi is a spiritual leader and religious teacher of a Jewish community or congregation. In the 2 decades since their arrival, as Cherry Hill's population grew, so had the Jewish community that now made up almost a third of Cherry Hill's 70,000 residents. Many in that community were ethnic Jews, people who can trace their ancestry back to the land of Israel, and others were non-ethnic Jews who had converted to Judaism. And just a few years after taking that job as assistant rabbi at Emmanuel Temple, Fred had gone on to found his own synagogue named Makor Shalom, which is Hebrew for source of peace. Central to Judaism is the belief in one God who revealed himself through ancient prophets. But Fred's new synagogue also focused on adapting the 3,800-year-old religion to the social and cultural conditions of the modern world. And Fred's gamble had paid off big time. By 1994, Makor Shalom had grown from a few families meeting in members' houses into the largest Jewish temple in Cherry Hill, with a congregation of almost 4,000 members. And Fred and Carol had moved from their small apartment to a comfortable 4-bedroom colonial house in one of the many subdivisions that had slowly but surely nibbled away at what had once been Cherry Hill's rolling farmland. But during those years, Fred was not the only one finding success. The last 2 decades had also been very good to Carol. She and Fred had had 1 daughter and 2 sons, and all 3 children were now either working or going to college or medical school. And 10 years ago, as Fred was busy building his congregation, Carol had decided to pursue her own dream. Working right out of her kitchen in their home at 204 Highgate Lane, Carol had poured her boundless energy into starting a business baking kosher cakes and selling them to local restaurants. With such a large Jewish community in Cherry Hill, Carol had recognized that there was an unmet demand among that group of customers for cakes and sweets that met strict Jewish dietary guidelines. And it would turn out the Gentile, non-Jewish residents of Cherry Hill were just as enthusiastic about Carol's cakes and cookies as the Jewish population was. So before long, what had started out as first Carol, then a handful of close friends making cakes in their ovens at home, had grown into Classic Cakes Company, with 2 large retail stores, one in nearby Audubon, and the other right there where Carol was standing, at the Eagle Plaza Shopping Center in Voorhees. Now, Classic Cakes employed close to 50 people, and combined sales from both bakeries easily topped $10,000 a day. And now, Carol thought to herself as she shouldered her purse and turned toward her own car out there in the parking lot, it was time to get on to the second half of her workday. It was Tuesday, October 25th, and on every Tuesday in the late afternoon, Carol and the other managers of Classic Cakes got together for their weekly business meeting in Cherry Hill, at the home of the company's Director of Human Resources. It was a meeting that often lasted as long as 3 hours. But as Carol walked over to her dark Toyota Camry out in the strip mall parking lot, opening the car door and slipping into the driver's seat, that sense of peace she had felt when she had looked up at the sky a few minutes earlier had left her. In its place was a sense of uneasiness. It had to do with her husband, Fred, and the 6-month sabbatical that he had taken at the beginning of this year. A sabbatical is an extended paid leave period that gives an employee a chance to travel and study. And in Fred's case, the other staff at his synagogue had basically encouraged him to take this sabbatical, almost like it was a reward for all the hard work managing such a big congregation. And Fred had been excited about this sabbatical, but instead of using it to travel or study like most people do, Fred just used the time to grow out his thinning gray hair into a long ponytail and then just kind of hung around the house in Cherry Hill and at his synagogue, Makor Shalom. Over the last 10 months, her husband had also become increasingly critical of his assistant rabbi, and to Carol, even after his sabbatical period had ended, Fred had seemed very distracted and preoccupied. Now, as Carol drove her car out of the Eagle Plaza parking lot and headed towards Route 70, she tried to reassure herself that Fred's change in behavior couldn't possibly have anything to do with their marriage. After all, they'd been together for almost 30 years, and during that time, Carol had come to know and cherish the qualities that made her and Fred such a strong couple. Where Fred was charismatic and bold, Carol was practical, warm, and good at listening to people. While Fred inspired people, Carol had a knack for making them feel like she was a trusted member of their family. And even though they had come from such different backgrounds, Carol and Fred had formed a loving and productive partnership. Carol, who had been born to wealthy parents, had grown up on the ocean side of New York in a big house with grounds that rolled down to the shore of Hewlett Bay. Fred, who was 1 year older than Carol, was the only child of immigrants who had grown up in the blue-collar section of Queens, New York, where his father had run a struggling dry cleaning business and his mother had stayed home to take care of Fred. Carol and Fred had met on a blind date when they were both in college. Fred was studying religion at Trinity University in Connecticut, and Carol was studying psychology at an exclusive women's college in Massachusetts. Carol, who was small and elegant with auburn-colored hair, intelligent dark eyes, and great taste in clothes and jewelry, was instantly attracted to Fred, whose physical strength and rugged good looks made him seem much taller than his 5 feet 4 inch tall frame. The attraction was 100% mutual. The two of them got married in 1965, moved to Queens, where Fred was later ordained as a rabbi, and by 1971, Cherry Hill, New Jersey would become the Nulander's permanent home. And while Carol knew that the passage of the years and the daily routines of everyday life were bound to take the edge off the passion and romance that had brought her and Fred together 3 decades earlier, but she still felt that same attraction to Fred and she knew that he felt the same way about her. Besides, in less than a week, they'd have some much-needed time to spend together when they headed up to New York this Saturday, October 29th, to visit some relatives. With this comforting thought in mind, Carol dragged her thoughts back to the work ahead of her. And by 4 p.m., after stopping on her way to run a couple of errands, Carol pulled into the driveway of the house where she would meet with her management team. A few hours later, Carol was once again back in her Toyota Camry, but even now her workday was not quite finished, because it had become Carol's habit that several days a week she would take home that day's cash from both of her bakery branches, and then she would count the money right at her dining room table. Then, the next morning, she could just deposit the cash at the bank first thing. And while Carol thought this was an efficient and convenient way of doing things, Fred thought it was totally reckless, and he hated that she brought all that money home. Even though Carol kept telling Fred that no one outside of her management circle knew that she sometimes traveled with anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 in cash tucked into her burgundy wallet at the bottom of her handbag, Fred told her that all of her bakery employees must see her walk out of the store with all that cash, and so he thought Carol was just asking to get robbed. But Carol had always waved off his concerns, saying that her employees were highly vetted and would never do that to her. And where they lived, Cherry Hill, was known as a very safe and quiet neighborhood. And so Carol told Fred that, no one's ever going to break in and try to steal from them. After getting the cash from both of her bakery locations and hopping back into her car to make the ride back home, Carol glanced at her watch and saw that she still had time to call her 24-year-old daughter, Rebecca. Rebecca was married and a hospital administrator in Philadelphia. Carol had always been very close with Rebecca, and so she cherished these daily phone calls with her. So as Carol drove along, she picked up her car phone, she dialed Rebecca's number, and a few minutes later, she and her daughter were chatting happily about the day's events. Carol was still on the phone when she pulled into her driveway at 204 Highgate Lane. But before she could wrap up the call with Rebecca, Carol was suddenly startled by a loud knock on her car window right next to her head. After nearly dropping her phone, Carol turned and looked outside and saw this huge man standing there right in her driveway. Seeing the look of alarm on Carol's face, the stranger stepped back and put his hands up in the air reassuringly. Carol told Rebecca, who was now asking, what's going on, to just hang on for a minute, that someone was here, and then Carol rolled her window down just a few inches and asked what this guy wanted. And the man in the driveway apologized for startling Carol, and then told her he was just there to see the rabbi and to deliver a package to him. Instantly, Carol could feel herself relax. She had been a rabbi's wife long enough that she'd come to expect visits from members of his congregation for all kinds of reasons and at all kinds of hours, day and night. Rolling the car window down the rest of the way, Carol smiled at the visitor and gestured toward the darkened house. She told him that the rabbi was not home yet, but the man was welcome to come inside and wait and deliver the package in person. After hearing bits of this conversation her mother had just had with this unexpected visitor, Rebecca felt concerned, and when her mom put the phone back to her ear, Rebecca asked her to please give a call once this guy has left so Rebecca would know that her mom was okay. Carol agreed and then ended the call with Rebecca, and then Carol got out of her car, she shut the door behind her, and began walking toward her house with the visitor walking right behind her. Carol had left her handbag filled with all the money in her car trunk. She would come out later when her visitor had left to bring it inside. But for now, Carol led the way to the front door, and when she got there, she unlocked it and gestured for her visitor to step into the small, warm entrance. But once the visitor was inside, the man began acting strange, glancing quickly left and right at the living room and dining rooms on either side of him and Carol. Then he began shifting his weight from one foot to another, and then suddenly, kind of awkwardly, he blurted out to Carol, can I just use your bathroom for a minute? Sensing what she took to be his embarrassment at having to make this request, Carol just smiled and said, of course, and directed him through the kitchen to the first floor bathroom at the back of the house. And then Carol walked back to the front of the house. When the man returned a few minutes later, Carol was standing near the front door looking through the mail that had been delivered that day, and she told the visitor that he was welcome to take a seat in the living room. But the big man just thanked her, said he was sorry for bothering her, and just handed Carol a plain white envelope and asked if she could give it to the rabbi. And then the visitor reached his hand out to open the front door. Meanwhile, almost without thinking, Carol, who had been going through the mail, when she was handed this envelope, she just opened it right away. And when she saw its contents, which was nothing, it was an empty envelope, she put her hand out and stopped this guy and said, "Hey, wait a minute, it's empty. Did you give me the right one?" The man looked startled and then told Carol he must have made a mistake and he picked up the wrong envelope earlier to bring by, and so he'd just have to come by another time. And then, without waiting to hear what Carol had to say, this man very quickly left the house and disappeared into the darkness. Back inside the house, Carol just tore up the empty envelope and dropped it into the wastebasket. Then she picked up the cordless landline phone and dialed Rebecca to tell her daughter that she didn't need to worry, that the man was gone. And as Carol told her daughter about this guy, she laughed and smiled to herself as she described how he came in and just used the bathroom, gave her an empty envelope, and then ran away. It was just another day in the life of a rabbi's wife. An odd but funny story that Carol would tell friends a couple of times in the following couple of days before forgetting all about it. But exactly 1 week later, both Carol and her daughter, Rebecca, would find themselves remembering that strange encounter all too well. Not long after 8 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, November 1st, 1994, Carol was once again arriving at her home on Highgate Lane after having left the weekly Classic Cakes business meeting. The weekend trip she and Fred had just taken to New York had not gone at all the way Carol had hoped. And now, as she pulled her car into the driveway and looked at her darkened house, she told herself that the dissatisfaction that her husband had told her he felt in their marriage was just the result of a late midlife crisis. It had all come out during a big argument they had had on their way home from New York that past Sunday, and Carol was still feeling really hurt and angry. By Monday night, both Carol and Fred had calmed down and agreed that they would go to both separate and joint marriage counseling sessions. They had also talked to each other about cutting back on some of the activities that over the years had drawn them into almost separate lives, Fred's religious duties and Carol's business. But Carol was still upset and shaken, and as she parked her car, turned off the engine, grabbed her purse, and then walked through a swirl of fallen leaves to the house, all she wanted was to get inside and call her daughter Rebecca. Carol knew that hearing her daughter's voice, maybe planning a shopping trip together next weekend, would put Carol in a happier frame of mind. And sure enough, a few minutes later, when Carol heard her daughter pick up the phone and say hello, Carol's spirits lifted. With a sigh of relief, Carol kicked off her shoes in the front hall and then settled in for a nice long chat. But only partway through their call, at around 8:30 p.m., Carol was interrupted by a knock on the front door. Carrying the cordless phone with her, Carol walked to the entryway and peered out the big oval stained glass window in the center of the door. Even through the colored glass, Carol recognized her visitor right away. It was the same huge guy who had stopped by last Tuesday with the empty envelope. Carol swung the door open, and even before the man had time to say, "Hey, it's me again," Carol had invited him inside. She assumed that he was there to see the rabbi again, or maybe this time deliver an envelope that actually had something inside of it. As the man stepped inside, Carol very quietly whispered into the phone to her daughter that her visitor was the bathroom man again. Then Carol turned to her visitor and said she'd be off the phone in a minute, and for now he should just make himself comfortable in the living room. A minute later, Carol wrapped up her call with her daughter, and she put the cordless phone down on a wooden bench in the entryway. And then, when she turned around, she was surprised to see her visitor, the bathroom man, had still not moved to the living room. He was still just standing right in front of the front door. Carol let out a quiet sigh, thinking to herself this man was still just as awkward now as he had been the last time they had met. But Carol's years of practice as a hostess kicked in, and she made herself smile. And stepping in front of her visitor, Carol invited the man to follow her deeper into the house. But Carol had only taken 1 or 2 steps away from him when she suddenly felt a big hand grab her left shoulder. And then, before Carol could turn around or even understand what was happening, she felt an explosion of pain as something smashed into the back of her head. The blow was so hard it knocked Carol's glasses off of her face and sent her staggering into the middle of the living room. Then, all at once, she felt a powerful shove to the middle of her back, and then she fell to her knees. A moment later, blood streaming down the sides of her face and into her ears, Carol collapsed onto the white carpet. Later, when the bathroom man looked inside of Carol's burgundy-colored wallet he had taken from her home, he couldn't believe his eyes. He'd been expecting to see thousands of dollars. Instead, he pulled out a grand total of $150. That day had been one of the rare days that Carol had decided not to bring home the cash from that day's sales at the 2 Classic Cakes locations. Meanwhile, at Temple Makor Shalom, located just a few minutes away from Highgate Lane, Rabbi Fred Nulander was finding it almost impossible to end the workday and get home. He'd had to check in on the weekly Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that was going on in one of the conference rooms, and he'd also sat in on choir rehearsal and one of the Jewish study classes taught by his assistant rabbi. He had checked in with Carol earlier that afternoon by phone before her business meeting. Since their argument on Sunday, their conversations had felt strained. Trying to ignore the frosty tone in his wife's voice, Fred had told her that he was probably going to be late that night, but at around 6 p.m., he did plan to go back to their house and have dinner with their son Matthew, but then he'd be leaving again and he wouldn't see her again until late. 20-year-old Matthew was a first-year medical student now at nearby Rutgers University, but he was still working part-time as an emergency medical technician with the Cherry Hill Fire Department. He lived at home with his parents, Carol and Fred, but between his classes and his 12-hour EMT shifts, his parents did not actually see much of him. Finally, just after 9 p.m. that night, Fred stepped out the door of Makor Shalom into the cool, cloudy November night. Like his wife Carol, Fred had also been thinking a lot about all the two of them had built and made together over the past nearly 3 decades. He knew his son Matt had overheard him and Carol arguing after they got home from their weekend trip to New York, and he also knew that Matt had wanted to talk to him over their dinner earlier that evening about what was going on with his parents. But his marriage was just not something Fred wanted to discuss with his children, and so he had pointedly turned the conversation in another direction every time Matt tried to talk about it. Now, 15 minutes after leaving the temple, Fred pulled his car into the driveway of 204 Highgate Lane. The lights were on in the house, and Carol's car was in its usual place. A minute later, at 9:20 p.m., Fred was at the front door of his house, and when he tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, he found it was unlocked. Fred shook his head at the lack of security, thinking about all that money Carol might be counting right now at the dining room table. Once the door was open, Fred expected to hear his wife immediately call out to see if that was him, but instead, the house seemed unusually still and quiet. And then, as Fred stepped inside the house, he saw Carol's feet just visible in the entrance to their living room. No shoes, just socks. A few more steps forward, and what Fred saw on the floor and walls and ceiling of the living room was so shocking that for a moment he was sure he was going to pass out. Struggling to make sense of the scene in front of him, Fred slowly started backing up and reaching out blindly behind him for the cordless phone that Carol had left in the entryway just an hour earlier. 2 minutes later, at 9:22 p.m., the dispatcher at the Cherry Hill Police Department picked up an incoming 911 call. The man's voice at the other end of the line sounded like it was being dragged out of him. "My wife is on the floor and there's blood all over." But a minute later, that same man's voice had sharpened into something closer to a scream. Standing in his front hallway talking to 911, Fred realized that his son Matthew was probably hearing this 911 call right now, and that Matt, being an EMT, might be among the medical personnel that were now being rushed to the Nulander family home. The last of his composure crumbled, and Fred began begging the 911 operator not to let his son anywhere near his house. He could not let his son see his mother the way she was. 7 minutes later, Highgate Lane was crowded with police cars and emergency vehicles. Matt had not been allowed inside of the house, and he and Fred were standing together at the end of the driveway when an EMT came over and told them that, unfortunately, Carol was deceased. And no, it did not look like suicide, it looked like murder. By 10 p.m., crime scene techs and homicide detectives had also started arriving at the scene. Officers put up yellow crime tape to hold back the gathering crowd of friends and neighbors that had begun to gather in the street outside of the Nulander's house. Friends also drove to Rebecca's apartment in Philadelphia to bring her back to Cherry Hill to join her father and her brother Matt. Later that same night, Fred's assistant rabbi would call another rabbi near the University of Michigan, where Carol and Fred's other son Benjamin was a freshman, so Benjamin would not be alone when the call came through that his mother was dead. Meanwhile, the investigation into Carol's death was already moving quickly. By 11 p.m. that night, Camden County detectives John Long and Arthur Folks had already zeroed in on their first potential suspect, Fred. After all, he was both the husband of the victim and the person who found Carol's body. And detectives' initial impression of the crime scene had weighed against the idea that the murder had been committed by a stranger in the course of a robbery. There had been no forced entry, no sign that the house had been ransacked, and Carol was still wearing valuable gold and diamond jewelry when her body had been discovered. The detectives were also suspicious of how calm Fred was when they first saw him. And the fact that there was not a single drop or smear of blood on his clothing told them that after finding his wife laying there, Fred had not made any attempt to check for a pulse or try to offer his wife any kind of aid, because if he had, he would have had blood all over him. And although the detectives would have to wait until the forensics reports came back from the crime lab, the techs working the crime scene were not finding any fingerprints, no footprints or even impressions, and no sign of a murder weapon, which made investigators think that this attack had to have been carefully planned. And so detectives instantly became very interested in learning more about the Nulanders' marriage. But before even having their first informal interview with Fred, the detectives assigned police officers to start interviewing neighbors to see if anyone had information about when Carol arrived home that evening and whether neighbors had seen any recent unusual or suspicious activity. Detectives also wanted to know if there were any security cameras on nearby homes that might have captured footage of someone entering or leaving the Nulander house. With all that done, the two detectives left the house just after 11 p.m. and joined Fred and his two older children inside the heated interior of one of the ambulances still parked outside the house. And right away, after speaking with them, the detectives learned about a new number one suspect. Because Rebecca had wasted no time telling the detectives about the two visits her mother had had from the so-called bathroom man, the stranger who had gone into the Nulander home with Carol exactly 1 week ago with the empty envelope, and the second visit had been that night. And now it seemed clear that tonight's visit from the bathroom man must have happened just before Carol was killed. And when Fred told police that Carol often brought home large amounts of cash from the bakeries, detectives realized that if all that turned out to be true, Carol may have been the target of a robbery after all. This possibility was strengthened when Fred and his children were able to confirm that there was something missing from the Nulander house, the burgundy-colored wallet where Carol hid her envelope full of cash. By 1:30 a.m. in the early hours of Wednesday, November 2nd, so just hours after Carol has been found, detectives had relocated to the Cherry Hill police station and were ready to conduct individual formal interviews, starting with Fred and his children. Rebecca repeated her information about the bathroom man, as well as telling police every detail she could remember from her recent phone calls with her mother. As for her parents' marriage, she said she was not aware of any serious problems or issues, but then again, she said she had not been living with them for some time. But in the interview with Rebecca's brother, Matt, which began at 2:30 a.m., he reluctantly admitted that his parents might have been going through some issues in their marriage. He told them about how his parents had gotten into that big fight during their car ride home from New York 3 days earlier, and that after they had returned, his mother had told him that his dad wanted out of the marriage. But by Monday, Matt said that things seemed to have calmed down, and yesterday afternoon, so Tuesday, the day Carol was killed, she'd even called Matt and told him not to worry, that his parents had done a lot of talking together and everything was going to be fine. It was 3:30 a.m. when Fred finally was asked to come into the interrogation room. When he answered the detective's questions, his voice sounded tired. By the end of the interview, it was obvious that he was finding it difficult to focus. He told investigators that the day before, he and Matthew had left the house together after their dinner around 6 p.m., and that Fred had gone straight to the temple, where he stayed until just a few minutes after 9 p.m. And then he drove back home and he discovered his wife. When asked, Fred told detectives that he didn't think Carol was having any issues with any of her coworkers at Classic Cakes. He also told detectives that he couldn't think of really anyone in her life that would want to hurt her. And as for this bathroom man and the letter or package he wanted to give to Rabbi Fred, Fred just shook his head. Unexpected and sometimes bizarre visits came with the territory of ministering to the religious and spiritual needs of 920 different families. But Fred said he was not aware of or expecting any deliveries back on October 25th, so the bathroom man's first visit to Carol, or last night when the bathroom man had made his second appearance. He told detectives that Carol had mentioned the first encounter with the bathroom man to him, but she had seemed more amused by the whole thing than alarmed by it. And she had apparently not given anyone, including Fred or Rebecca or Matt, a real description of what the bathroom man had looked like, aside from saying he was big and dressed in a windbreaker. As for Fred's relationship with Carol, he said it was good, very good, that they both had been very faithful to each other and that they loved each other and never had to go get counseling or anything like that, and at no point had their relationship ever come close to being physically abusive. As Fred said all this, the detectives were acutely aware of the fact that Fred did not mention the fight he had apparently gotten into with Carol a few days earlier, according to his son Matt. When Fred was asked about the lack of blood on his clothes and why he hadn't at least reached down and checked for a pulse when he saw his wife on the floor, Fred bowed his head and then told them that it was immediately obvious to him that she was dead. A few hours after Fred's interview, on that same morning, Wednesday, November 2nd, police were back at the Nulander house to do a thorough inspection of the outside of the property. Crime techs had finished their work earlier in the morning and sent all the evidence they had collected from inside the house to the crime lab for analysis, and Carol's body had been transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Neighbors woke up that Wednesday morning to the sight of investigators using a ladder truck they'd borrowed from the local fire department to check the roof of the Nulander's house for any clues. Police officers had also fanned out to interview Carol's business partners and staff at Classic Cakes and Fred's assistant rabbi from Temple Makor Shalom. Other officers were tracking down any leads or information about deliveries to the Nulander property that may have been scheduled for around the time Carol was killed. But despite the promising lead about the bathroom man and the momentum of the first 48 hours, the investigation into Carol's murder almost immediately slowed to a discouraging crawl. No one had come up with any information that would help police find this mysterious bathroom man. Investigators couldn't find any deliveries scheduled for the Nulander house on either October 25th or November 1st, the 2 days the bathroom man was there. And Fred's assistant rabbi just shook his head no when detectives asked him if he knew of any marital problems between Fred and Carol. On Thursday, 2 days after the murder, and the day Carol's body was released by the medical examiner's office back to her family, 2,000 people attended a funeral service for Carol that was held in the sanctuary of Temple Makor Shalom. And after the funeral service, Fred announced that Carol's Shiva, the Jewish equivalent of a wake, would be held at the Nulander's house, in the same room where Carol was killed. Despite contractors having come in and thoroughly cleaned that room, Carol's friends and family still noticed faint bloodstains under the new coat of paint on the walls and ceiling. It wasn't until the Nulander's phone records came back a few weeks after Carol's death that police finally got a break in the case. While looking for calls that had been made to or by Carol, police noticed one number that showed up over and over again. But it had nothing to do with Carol, and everything to do with her husband and a very high-profile member of his congregation. And by early December, police uncovered a scandal that would rock Cherry Hill and focus national media attention on one of the state's most charismatic religious leaders. Police would also find another possible suspect in the murder of Carol Nulander. It would turn out Fred had lied to police when he described his marriage as being really solid, and he'd told an even bigger lie when he described himself as being a faithful husband. Instead, starting on December 24th, 1992, so 2 years before Carol was killed, Fred had begun having an affair with a 48-year-old local celebrity and member of his congregation, Elaine Sonsini, and so that phone number that had shown up in the Nulander's call records was Elaine Sonsini's number. Elaine was a well-known on-air radio personality who hosted a popular morning news program out of a big station in Philadelphia. She had met Fred when he had officiated her late husband's funeral. Before, and especially during, the rabbi's 6-month sabbatical, he and Elaine had been meeting up almost every day to have sex, even deadbolting the door of Fred's private office and using Temple McCord for their illicit get-togethers. As police started to press Elaine for details about her involvement with Fred and whether she had any direct or indirect involvement with the murder of his wife, Elaine, who had a solid alibi, decided it was time to lawyer up and go public with her side of the story and the details of the affair. And suddenly, Fred was back at the top of the suspect list, both in terms of the police investigation and the news accounts that were now appearing in major regional and local media. For Fred, when this affair went public, it was devastating. There are lots of married couples who have experienced infidelity, but in Fred's case, his affair and infatuation with Elaine had automatically stamped him not only as one of America's many unfaithful husbands, but also as a murderer. Even his alibi was now being treated by investigators and definitely by the media as too good, too convenient, that maybe the rabbi had just arranged for his wife's death so he could ride off into the sunset with the beautiful Elaine Sonsini. But despite Fred continuing to shout from the rooftops that he hadn't done anything and that the police still had not found a single shred of evidence connecting him to his wife's murder, Fred knew it didn't really matter, because the media, and to some degree the police, had already decided he was guilty. And so, desperate to clear his name, Fred went on the offensive. Not only did he hire a defense attorney to represent him, he also revealed to the public that within days of Carol's death, he had already hired his own private investigator to try to find out who killed his wife and why. 49-year-old Len Genoff had been both a member of Temple McCord and an acquaintance of Fred's since 1992. But it was Len's background in security and covert operations with the US and Israeli Secret Services, along with his private investigator's license, that had caught Fred's attention. Len also had close ties with the local police. And even though Len had not really made any more progress in finding Carol's killer than Camden County law enforcement, once Fred went public with Len's involvement in the case in early 1995, Len became a sort of unofficial spokesperson for the embattled rabbi. But for Fred, despite his best efforts, his life seemed to just continue to go from bad to worse. On February 26, 1995, the damage to his reputation had become so bad that he resigned his post as head rabbi of the synagogue he had founded 20 years earlier. Several months later, on June 9, 1995, Fred's lover, Elaine Sonsini, left Fred and married one of the police officers who had been assigned to help with the investigation into Carol Nulander's death. A year after that, in April of 1996, the Central Conference of American Rabbis suspended Fred from practicing as a rabbi for a minimum of 2 years as punishment for his extramarital affair. But despite Fred's life crumbling all around him, his private investigator continued to have his back, telling everyone that while Fred certainly was guilty of adultery, that didn't mean he was also guilty of murder. Fred deeply appreciated Len's support, but what he really needed from his private eye, or from anyone at this point, was evidence about who actually killed his wife. But it wasn't until late April 2000, almost 6.5 years after Carol Nulander was brutally murdered, that police finally would find that evidence. That month, investigators answered a phone call from someone who said they had important information that would help authorities identify Carol's killer. The conversation that came next would turn everything the police thought they knew about this case upside down. Based on what this caller was able to tell law enforcement, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Carol on the evening of November 1st, 1994. The bathroom man was sure he had planned Carol's murder down to the last detail. But when Carol had let him into her house on the night of Tuesday, October 25th, he knew right away that he had made a mistake. As soon as he stepped inside, he had seen immediately that Carol's purse, and more importantly, the burgundy-colored wallet, were nowhere in sight. And so the bathroom man, he struggled for a moment, trying to keep his composure before changing his plan. He had to be sure the purse and the wallet were here. So, thinking quickly, he asked Carol if he could use her bathroom. But instead of actually going to the bathroom, the man just walked around Carol's first floor, checking all of the rooms for this purse and wallet. But when he couldn't find them, he knew he'd just have to come back another time. And so he walked back to the front door where Carol was, and he handed her that envelope, telling her it was the package he had come to give to the rabbi, and then he was about to leave when Carol had opened it up. Now, the bathroom man knew the envelope was empty. Delivering it to the rabbi was just his excuse he was using to get inside of the house. And so when Carol immediately opened the envelope right in front of him and told him, "Hey, look, it's empty," the bathroom man suddenly panicked, wondering if Carol was onto him. But he could see in her face right away that she wasn't. She was just concerned he had not delivered the right letter, and so he should come by another time when he had the right letter. 1 week later, on November 1st, the bathroom man took steps not to repeat his earlier mistake. This time, he waited until Carol had walked inside of her house, carrying her purse over her shoulder, before he also walked up to the door and began knocking. Bathroom man felt a stab of alarm when the door opened and he saw that Carol was talking to someone on the telephone. But that was followed by relief when she invited him inside before he even had to say who he was or why he was there. Once inside, he glanced quickly into both front rooms, and this time he saw the purse sitting on the dining room table. Even as Carol finished her call and placed the cordless phone down on the bench near them in the entryway, bathroom man was already adjusting his windbreaker to make sure he could easily access the 1-foot-long metal pipe he had stuck in his back pants pocket. Satisfied that the purse and wallet were definitely here, he focused again on Carol and heard her tell him to follow her through the living room into the sun parlor. But as soon as Carol had turned away from him and had begun taking a few steps across the hardwood floor onto the white carpet, bathroom man reached behind his back and pulled out the metal pipe and clutched it in his right hand. And then, with his left hand, he reached out and he grabbed Carol's left shoulder, forcing her to come to an abrupt stop, and then before she could turn around, bathroom man had lifted the pipe into the air and brought it crashing down into the back of Carol's head. A moment later, he used his left hand to shove Carol hard in the center of her back, sending her flying into the living room where her knees began to buckle out from under her. As she collapsed forward onto the ground, Carol uttered a single word: "Why?" Bathroom man didn't answer her. Instead, he turned back to the door and quickly motioned to his much younger accomplice who was waiting outside in the bushes to come inside and finish the job. Seconds later, bathroom man had handed off the length of pipe to his much younger companion, and as bathroom man headed for the dining room to get the burgundy wallet out of Carol's purse, his companion got to work on Carol. From the dining room, bathroom man could hear the sickening thuds of what would be at least 12 savage blows to Carol's head that would break her skull and inflict catastrophic injuries to her brain. An autopsy would later show that Carol had tried to protect herself by putting her hands up over the back of her head, but this younger accomplice of bathroom man had hit her hands so hard with the pipe that he'd practically amputated one of her fingers. When bathroom man stepped back into the living room to make sure Carol was dead, he had to stop and catch his breath. The beating the younger companion had administered on Carol had taken less than a minute, but in those 45 seconds, the upswings of the metal pipe had sprayed the walls and ceiling with so much blood that it looked like a scene out of a horror movie. And Carol lay on her side at the center of it all, her neat blue pantsuit and print top slowly darkening in the pool of blood, spreading out around her and soaking into the thick pile of the white carpet. Bathroom man walked over and checked Carol for a pulse, and when he didn't find one, he and his younger companion left the house. Once outside, the two men got into a single car and drove to a nearby brightly lit parking lot outside of a department store. After his younger accomplice changed into clean clothes, bathroom man gathered up any blood-stained belongings and the blood-stained pipe, and he stuffed it all into a small duffel bag. Then he pulled out Carol's burgundy wallet. He thought of the thousands of dollars that he was sure to find inside of it as a bonus payment on top of what he had already been paid to commit this murder. But inside the wallet, all he found was $150. The two killers split the money, and then with a sudden gesture of disgust, bathroom man threw the burgundy wallet onto the floor of his car. A minute later, Bathroom Man's accomplice had climbed out of the passenger seat and settled in behind the wheel of his own car that he'd parked there earlier in the evening. He gave Bathroom Man a wave before pulling out of the parking lot and heading back to the apartment the two men shared. A few minutes later, Bathroom Man was also on the road, but he was not going back to the apartment. Instead, he headed east towards the nearest police station. He stopped only once along the way, to buy 4 cups of coffee. Later that night, he would make a drive out to Philadelphia and stop at different dumpsters along the way to dispose of the small duffel and bloody clothes, the murder weapon, and the empty burgundy wallet. But for right now, he had an alibi he needed to build. So at 9:12 p.m., Bathroom Man, aka Rabbi Fred Nulander's own private investigator, Len Genoff, did what he did on most Tuesday nights. He drove to the Evesham Township Police Station 5 miles from the Nulander house, and then he walked inside and made his way to the Detective Bureau, where he delivered the coffees he had bought to his good buddies on the night shift, and where he settled in to wait for the news to break that Rabbi Fred Nulander's wife was dead. It wouldn't be until 2 days after Carol's murder, on Thursday, November 3rd, at her funeral service in the sanctuary of Temple Makor Shalom, that Len would again see the person who had promised him $30,000 for killing the rabbi's wife. When it was Len's turn in line to console the stricken and grieving rabbi, Len stepped forward to shake Fred Nulander's hand, but before he could, Carol's husband pulled Len in for a big hug. And when the two men were cheek to cheek, Fred whispered his thanks in Len's ear for getting the job done. The murder had gone exactly as Rabbi Fred Nulander had planned it. It would turn out that back in the summer of 1994, not long after the end of Fred's 6-month sabbatical, his mistress, Elaine Sonsini, had told Fred he had until the end of that year to end his marriage with Carol, or Elaine would break off their affair. As the rabbi started to think about his choices, he decided he'd rather see Carol dead than risk the damage that a divorce might do to his reputation. So, in August, Fred approached Len Genoff, a member of his congregation who claimed to have worked with both the U.S. and Israeli secret services. Both those claims, and almost everything else Len had told people about his background, insecurity, and covert operations, turned out to be false. But when Len's rabbi and spiritual leader Fred Nulander asked him if he would be willing to put his skills to work and kill a so-called enemy of Israel, Len said yes. Only the enemy turned out to be the rabbi's wife, and her only sin was that she stood between the rabbi and his mistress. While Len knew who Carol was, Carol did not know who Len was. There were over 4,000 people in the congregation, and so Carol and Len had just never actually met. After Len agreed to do the job, Fred spent the next few months explaining to Len exactly how he wanted the murder to look, like a robbery gone wrong. Fred also gave Len a hand-drawn map showing the layout of the inside of the Nulander house and where Len should look for Carol's purse and wallet. The murder would have to take place on a Tuesday night when Carol and Fred's son, Matthew, was at work, and when there were enough evening activities at the temple that Fred could construct an airtight alibi for himself. Then, immediately after the murder, the rabbi would hire Len to act as a private investigator working to clear the rabbi's good name. Len had done a lot of things in his life that he was not proud of, but cold-blooded murder was not one of them. So, for this job, Len had decided to hire an accomplice, his 21-year-old roommate, Paul Daniels. Like his older friend, Paul was a recovering alcoholic, but he was also broke and he suffered from a variety of mental disorders. When Len offered Paul $7,500 if Paul would actually be the one to kill Carol, Paul could not believe his good fortune. On October 20th, 1994, 2 weeks prior to Carol's murder, when Len had actually handed the $7,500 to his young accomplice, Paul had grabbed the money and then jumped up out of his chair, where he spent most of his days watching TV, and he began yelling in excitement, "That bitch is dead!" But starting immediately after Carol's murder, the guilt over what he had done started eating away at Len Genoff. And by the beginning of 1996, so roughly a year and a half after Carol's murder, Len had become an off-the-record source, that's someone who was never identified by name, for a reporter who was covering the investigation into the Carol Nulander homicide. And by May of 2000, almost 6 years after Carol's death, that reporter, who had gradually learned the truth from Len, had convinced Len to go to police and tell them the truth about what happened to Carol. It would take 2 trials before a jury found Fred Nulander guilty of the murder of his wife Carol. As a star witness, Len Genoff was both a blessing and a curse. He could implicate the rabbi as the mastermind who set up the homicide, but Len's own history of telling one huge lie after another about his own life and background threw everything he had to say into question. And compared to the eloquent denials of Rabbi Fred and the fact that there was no hard evidence linking the rabbi to the actual murder, Fred Nulander's first trial in 2001 ended in a hung jury. But by the time the case was retried less than 1 year later, Rabbi Fred had lost his most important supporters, his children, Matt and Rebecca, both of whom wound up testifying against him. In November of 2002, Rabbi Fred was found guilty of murder and conspiracy, and on January 15, 2003, he was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Both Len Genoff and his accomplice Paul Daniels were convicted of aggravated manslaughter and sentenced to a maximum of 23 years. They were both released from prison in 2014 after serving their mandatory minimum of 10 years. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle. They had converted it into a rotating stage, and they put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages on this rotating stage. And so on each of these 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs about America. And so the way this would work, if you were in the audience, is you would walk into this theater that looked like a single theater with one stage right in front of you, but really what you were looking at is one of these 6 stages. And so the audience would sit down, they would see one of the acts, they'd see one performance on one of the stages, and then the stage would rotate. And so the audience would remain in the theater until all 6 stages had rotated in front of them and played their 2 to 4 minute long act. Debbie's job at America Sings was at the beginning of these shows where the audience would watch all 6 acts. She would go up before the very first act. She'd go on stage and she would greet the audience. And then the show would start. It would filter through all 6 of the stages. And then Debbie would get back on stage and she would say goodbye to that group of audience members. It was a simple gig and Debbie seemed to like it. And so on July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, and so it was 9 days after Debbie had started her job, Debbie was asked to come in for an evening shift. And so she left her house and she made it out to the attraction at about 10 p.m., which was right at the start of a show. And so she went right inside, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage and the show began. And so over the next 30 minutes, all 6 of the stages performed their acts. And then after the 6th act was done, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage. She said goodbye to the audience. And then as that audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Each of the 6 stages that made up this attraction had a fairly tall back wall. And behind each of these 6 back walls that were kind of in a ring was the center of the actual attraction. And in the center was this circular, fairly tall storage room. This storage room did not rotate. It was stationary. These stages and their respective back walls, they rotated around this storage room. And the gap between the outside of the storage room and the back of any of these back walls was only a few inches. It was very narrow, but it was big enough that a person, in theory, could get stuck back there. So it was a real hazard. However, Disney did not put any specific safeguards in place to prevent their staff from intentionally or unintentionally going into this space. They just told their staff to not go back there and be careful. So back on July 9th, after Debbie has said goodbye to the audience and she's walked towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage she's on to the adjoining stage. And when she does that, she either trips or falls or something happens, which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the two back walls of the two stages she was on. And so she falls through that gap and then gets wedged between the outside of the storage room and the back of one of the back walls. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck. And so she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. None of the staff hear her, or they don't recognize that this is a real call for help. And this new wave of people that are coming in, the new audience, they're all talking loudly, there's music playing, they don't really hear her, and anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later say they thought it was part of the show. And so as Debbie is screaming bloody murder, she cannot get out of this gap, this narrow gap she's stuck in. These stages, they start to move because the show is going to start. And because Debbie has nowhere to go, when the stage began to rotate, she got forcibly dragged and twisted and rolled, and her body began to contort, and bones started to break, and she was forced to continue moving through this narrow space because the stage was just going to keep on going until it reached its next position. And so finally, after it dragged her all the way to its next position, Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. She probably had dozens of broken bones, but she was alive and she's still totally stuck and she's screaming with every ounce of energy she has. But again, the audience, even though they heard her screaming, they assumed it was part of the show. And apparently the staff also heard her screams and convinced themselves it was just no big deal. And so 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again. And so Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged and smashed and broken as the stage again rotates to its next position. And she's still not dead. She's screaming out for help. No one is coming to help her. And so the entire show would play out, with the stage rotating through all of its sections. And then finally, at the end of the show, when one of the audience members alerted the staff that, hey, you should really go check out that screaming we heard. And at that point, they went for a look and they discovered Debbie, and she was very obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the America Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. The next story, which is our number 2 story on today's list, is called Water Closet. On Saturday, September 30th, 2017, a staff member at a North Wales country club noticed water leaking out of the bottom of an outside wall of one of their many bungalows. These bungalows, which were generally just vacation rentals, were single-story white structures situated up on this beautiful green hillside. The staff member, after seeing this leak, they just turn around and go back to the front office and they tell their boss about it. And then shortly after, 2 maintenance workers were sent out to check on this leak. And so these 2 workers, they go over to this bungalow and they knock on the front door. But after a while, when no one comes to the door, they pull out their master key and they begin to turn the lock. And as they do that, they yell out just in case, hey, we're here just to check on a leak. We have to come in. It's a potential emergency. And so they open up the door, they swing it open, and no one comes to the door. It's still silent. And they're looking into this property. And what they see is on the left, from their perspective, is a kitchen. And on their right is a living room. It was basically one big room that had been designated for 2 distinct functions. And so they yelled out again into this bungalow, hey, we're coming inside. We're just checking on this leak. And then they just walked straight across past the living room and past the kitchen to the back of this property where they reached a door. And this door led into a bedroom and this door was shut. And so just as a precaution, they knocked on the bedroom door, but nobody came to the door again. So they opened up the bedroom door and they looked into this room. And on the right side of the room, tucked up against the right wall, were 2 twin beds where the head of each bed was tucked up against the wall. And then in the middle of the room, at the base of these 2 beds, was a pile of unopened luggage. And so to the 2 maintenance workers, this told them that someone clearly was staying in this bungalow. Either they had just arrived or they were getting ready to leave, but apparently they were not there right now. And so the workers walked around the luggage and around the two beds. So they walked on the left side of the room all the way to the back where there was another closed door, and it went into the bathroom. And based on where the leak had been coming out of the structure, they believed it would be coming from this particular bathroom. And so again, they get up to this door and they knock on it because, they want to make sure no one's in there, but there's more silence. And so they open up the bathroom and right away they see water all over the bathroom floor. But as they scan around the bathroom, they look at the sink, they look at the shower, the toilet, none of them are overflowing or running. So it was not any of the usual suspects that had caused this leak. However, there was one other area in the bathroom that could have caused a water leak, and that was the airing cupboard. An airing cupboard is typically where you keep a hot water heater. It's basically like a walk-in closet where the majority of the space is taken up by this heater. And also generally people put in shelves in front of the heater to store their linens and towels and that sort of thing. And in this bungalow, the airing cupboard had its own door and it was right in the bathroom. And this door to the airing cupboard was right to the left of the door that led into the bathroom from the bedroom. And so these two workers, they reached over and they opened the door that led into this airing cupboard. And as soon as it swung in, they could tell right away where the leak was coming from. And they could tell right away they had a much, much bigger problem. 7 days earlier, 60-year-old former policewoman Mary Isherwood arrived at the North Wales Country Club. She and her ex-husband had for a long time owned one of these bungalows. However, they almost never stayed in it. They basically used it as an income property, renting it out to vacation goers. But they had recently decided that they wanted to actually sell the property. And so before the sale became final, Mary had told her ex-husband that she just wanted to go and spend a week actually enjoying the property and actually take a vacation there. And so originally she and some friends were going to go to this bungalow and spend a week there. But right before they were going to leave, Mary's friends all said they couldn't make it. And so Mary decided she would just go on her own. And so Mary arrives at this country club. It's late at night when she gets there. She gets to the bungalow. She puts her luggage down in her bedroom. And then instead of just kind of getting settled in and going to sleep, she decides she's going to go exercise. Mary was incredibly fit and healthy. She loved playing golf and running and exercising in general. And she knew the club had a pool. And so she reached into her luggage and she just pulled out a bathing suit. She switched into that. And then she went down to the pool and did some lap swimming. After that, she came back to her room where she took a shower, and then she climbed in bed without any clothes on. That was just how Mary liked to sleep. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Mary woke up to go use the bathroom. And so she hopped out of her twin bed. She walked around to the door that led into the bathroom. She went inside, she did her business. And then afterwards, as she was attempting to go back into her bedroom, she accidentally grabbed the door handle of the airing cupboard, which was right to the left of the door leading back to her bedroom. She opened it up, it swung inward. She stepped into the airing cupboard, which was totally pitch black. And as she walked in, she might have bumped into the shelves or realized, this was the wrong turn. But as soon as this happened, the door behind her had actually shut. And so she's inside of this tiny airing cupboard, realizing, okay, this is not where I need to go. I've made a silly mistake. She turned around to grab the door handle to open the airing cupboard back up again. But when she grabbed the knob, it disintegrated in her hands. It broke into multiple parts and fell to the ground. Now, the space she is in is pitch black. She has no way of knowing which parts go where for this doorknob. And so by touch, she reached down and she grabbed all these pieces and she probably tried to put them together and put it back on this door to try to get it open, but she just couldn't do it. And so eventually, Mary would have realized this is a pretty serious situation. She was staying at this bungalow by herself and she was not expected to check out for another week. So no one was going to be checking on her. And without this doorknob, she could not open this closet door. It was a hard wooden door. The locking mechanism was solid. There was just no way to open it without this doorknob. And so Mary began banging on the door and screaming out for help. But her bungalow was not actually connected to any other structures. It was a standalone. And so her voice did not carry very far. And the banging sounds she was making, those also did not carry very far. And so no one heard her. And so after several hours, she's just standing in this closet, probably thinking to herself, how in the world did I get myself in this position? But But after the initial shock of this totally bizarre situation she was in had worn off, she decided to act. And so she turned away from the door and she faced towards the back of this closet. She would have been face to face with a row of shelves, but she wouldn't have been able to see the shelves because it was totally dark. And then beyond the shelves, farther into this closet, was the actual hot water heater. There was no wall behind the shelves. Basically, there was a space behind the shelves where this heater was. And so Mary grabbed one of these shelves and she managed to break it off the wall. And then she turned around and used this piece of wood and tried to smash the door, but very quickly realized that was just going to do nothing. However, she began striking the wall right next to the door, and she realized she could break through the drywall. She was starting to kind of burrow a hole. And so maybe she thought to herself, if I can just build a hole big enough right next to the door, I can reach through the hole and maybe open this cupboard from the outside. And so she began using this shelf to smash this wall, and she's burrowing as fast as she can, but the progress must have been very, very slow because she decides she needs a different tool. So she turns back around, so she's facing the shelves again, and she breaks down a few more shelves to clear a path to get to the water heater. And then once she could step past the shelves, once there was a path, she got right in front of this water heater, and then by touch began feeling around for any pipes extending off of the heater. And when she found one, she got a good grip of it, and she began yanking and tugging on it until she managed to rip a piece of pipe off of the hot water heater. Now, as soon as she did that, she now had a pipe that was a far better tool for burrowing and creating this hole in the wall. However, as soon as that pipe broke off, cold water began leaking out of this hot water heater, the water that had not been heated yet, and it was being sprayed all over the inside of this cupboard. Now, this was a very small space, and so there was no way for Mary to get out from under this cold water, and so it was a shocking and probably very painful experience, but she now had her tool and figured, okay, this is awful, but I'll just use this tool, I'll burrow this hole, I'll get this cupboard open, and I'll get out of here. And so with the water raining down on her, Mary used her new piece of pipe and began digging and burrowing at that spot right next to the door. But after a while, probably several hours, she struck a brick wall. There was no way she could actually push through this wall and reach around and open the cupboard door. There was nothing she could do. It was a dead end. And so totally devastated and probably very exhausted from all the energy she used to burrow this hole, she stopped. She's still getting rained down on by all this freezing cold water. And instead of just totally giving up, she just turned and faced the wall that was leading into her bedroom. She began digging again, using this tool all over again to now dig a new hole on this other wall, most likely hoping that she could literally burrow a hole big enough that she could actually crawl through into her bedroom and escape. And so after several more hours of digging as fast and as hard as she could, while also periodically banging on the door and screaming out for help, she did eventually push through into her bedroom. However, in a cruel twist of fate, when she did finally poke through this wall, there was no bricks in the way, she hit what felt like another dead end. But in fact, what it was a picture frame with a glass cover across it had been screwed onto the wall in her bedroom. And this painting was right over where she was digging this hole. And so in her totally exhausted and panicked and saddened and scared state, she hits the back of this painting, and again, it's pitch black, and she's feeling through the hole most likely, and she's touching this hard back of this painting, and she's realizing, oh my goodness, I've hit another dead end. There's nowhere for me to go. Even though, in reality, she could have very easily just broken through that frame and then maybe made the hole a little bit bigger, and then she could have squeezed through it and escaped. But she didn't know that, and so she eventually just slouched to the ground and accepted her fate. 6 days later, when those two maintenance workers opened the airing cupboard door, they found Mary's body slumped up against the wall inside this closet. She had died of hypothermia. It would turn out other residents of the other bungalows nearby heard banging coming from this bungalow on Saturday night, the night that Mary actually got stuck. And then they also heard the banging the following morning, on Sunday morning. But none of the other residents reported it because they believed it was just construction or some other maintenance work. However, there was one couple staying in one of the nearby bungalows that thought there was something off about this banging, and they told each other if the banging persists past 5 p.m. on Sunday, so that's the day after Mary got stuck, this couple told each other that if it continues past 5 p.m., we'll report it. But as it happened, Mary stopped banging on the walls and yelling for help right around 5 p.m. on Sunday. And so this couple, right as they're getting ready to go tell the front desk, the banging stopped, and so they stopped worrying about it. It's unclear how long Mary survived after she stopped banging around 5 p.m. on Sunday. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, it could have been days. Mary's family would ultimately sue the country club for negligence. However, the outcomes of this case have not been made public. The next and final story, which is the top story of today's list, is called The Maze. In 2017, 71-year-old Bernard Gore was a retiree living in Tasmania, which is an island state of Australia. In January of that year, he and his wife of 50 years, Angela, decided to go visit their daughter who lived in Sydney, Australia. Now, they made this trip with some regularity, and they developed a sort of routine for every time they visited. They would land in Sydney, and then the first day they would spend it entirely with their daughter at her house. And then the next day, Angela would get up early, and she would head out into town and do some shopping on her own. And then sometime in the afternoon, Bernard would head out, and he would meet up with her for lunch at a very popular spot. It was called the Westfield Center Mall, and they had an amazing food court. So on January 5th of that year, Bernard and Angela, they land in Sydney, and like they always did, they went straight to their daughter's house and they spent the day with her. And then early the next morning, Angela got up and she headed out to do her shopping. And before she left, she confirmed with her husband that they would meet up for lunch at Westfield Center Mall. Now, as it happened that day, Angela actually chose to do her shopping at Westfield Center Mall. And so she was there around lunchtime when she was supposed to meet Bernard. And so when she looked at her watch and she realized it was time to meet him, she just simply stepped out of the shop she was in and headed over to the food court. And when she got there, she found their meeting spot. It was in front of one of their favorite restaurants. And she sat down and then she scanned around looking for her husband. But inside of this busy food court, she couldn't see him. And so she looked at her watch again and she realized she was a couple of minutes early. And so she grabbed a menu and she began looking for what she was going to order while she waited for him to show up. But 15 minutes would go by and Bernard would not show up. And so now he was late. And so Angela, at this point, she pulls her phone out and she tries calling her husband, but he didn't answer. However, that was kind of common for Bernard, so not necessarily a red flag. Angela would continue to try calling her husband for the next several minutes, and each time he would not answer. And so eventually Angela just gets frustrated and she's thinking to herself, maybe he just got sidetracked and he's walking around the mall somewhere, because Bernard was known for being a big window shopper. And as soon as Angela thought that, she was like, that's got to be it. And it was so frustrating for her that he had just totally blown off their lunch date. And so she stands up, she abandons her table, she's totally annoyed, and she heads out into the main shopping area to go find her husband. And so she's walking along, looking in each of the windows, expecting to see her husband. And at the same time, she's looking over her shoulder back towards the food court to see if maybe Bernard had shown up. But after 30 minutes of wandering around kind of right near the food court and not seeing him anywhere, Angela thinks to herself, you know what? I bet he thought we were supposed to meet at our daughter's house first. And so he probably hasn't even left the house yet. I bet he's just there waiting for me. And so Angela, when she realizes this, she stops looking for him in the mall. She turns around and she begins walking towards the mall exit. But before she reaches the exit door, a terrifying thought crosses her mind. What if Bernard got confused and has no idea where he is right now? A recent unfortunate development for Bernard was that he was showing early signs of dementia. It hadn't fully taken a hold of him yet, but he was clearly starting to forget things that he shouldn't. And so as soon as Angela thought of this, she went from being annoyed with her husband to being very worried about her husband. And so she sped through those doors outside and speed walked all the way back to her daughter's house, which was not far from the mall. And the whole time she's walking, she's telling herself she's going to walk inside and she's going to see Bernard. He's going to be in the house. But when she got to the house and went inside and saw her daughter said, "No, Dad left about 2 hours ago to go meet you. I haven't seen or heard from him since." Now, of course, both of them were extremely worried for Bernard, but they decided to just stay calm, that the best thing they could do right now would just be to stay put, stay at their daughter's house, and wait for Bernard to eventually come back, because the only other logical place he would go would be his daughter's house. And so they sat at the house, just kind of waiting, looking at the door, waiting for him to come in, but he didn't. And by 8 p.m., 6 hours after anybody had last seen Bernard, he still had not shown up. They couldn't get in touch with him, and so Angela called the police and reported him missing. Immediately, the police contacted the Westfield Center Mall security team and said, hey, we're looking for this guy. And they went right down to the food court where Bernard and Angela had said they were going to meet. And the mall security team walked all around, and they walked into all the nearby shops and kind of scanned the immediate vicinity near their meeting spot. But they reported back to police that there was no sign of Bernard. And they would also tell police that after reviewing their camera footage, and this mall had hundreds of cameras covering every angle, inside and out, everything is covered. They would tell police, after reviewing the footage, we didn't see Bernard enter or exit the mall at any point today. He was not here. And so the police, they take this information and they go back to Angela that night and they say, hey, look, we talked to the mall, and based on their security footage, they have no record of Bernard ever being in the mall. Do you have any idea where he could have gone? And Angela would say, no, the only places would have been the mall or maybe at our daughter's house. This is also when Angela explained to police that her husband had early signs of dementia, and so it was possible that he might have just gotten confused and he could be out on the street somewhere. But she assured the police that her husband, whenever this happened, whenever he got confused, he would just sit down and he would try to ask for help from anybody passing by, or he would just sit where he was and he would wait for his family to come find him. And so with this knowledge, the police went back out and they widened their search and they began looking in all the areas that were within walking distance of the Westfield Center Mall. At the same time, Angela and her daughter began trying to retrace Bernard's footsteps from the daughter's home in the direction of the Westfield Center Mall to see if maybe there was something obvious along the route that might have sidetracked him and kind of led him astray, and that maybe he'd be somewhere else in those directions. But as they were walking around, there really was nothing that stood out to them. And then eventually it just got too dark out and they had to just turn it in and go back to their house and hope that the next morning when they got up, the police would have found Bernard and that he was okay. But the next morning when they got up, the police had not found Bernard. There was no sign of him. There was no clues, nothing. And unfortunately, over the next several weeks, there was no sign of Bernard. Nobody knew what happened to him. On January 27th, so 3 weeks after Bernard had gone missing, a maintenance worker at the Westfield Center Mall was walking down the staff-only passageway. It was basically like this tunnel with no windows, all concrete. They kind of looped around the outside of the mall to help workers get to and from certain locations in the building. He's walking down this passageway when he looks down this one hallway that was very rarely used, and he sees at the end of it, barely lit up from the lights inside, there looks to be some equipment kind of propped up against the wall. And he's thinking to himself, there's no reason someone would leave their equipment at the end of this very rarely used hallway. It didn't make any sense. And so he decided to walk down and see whose equipment it was. And so he's making his way down and he's getting closer and closer, and he still can't quite figure out what it is. The lighting's not great, but when he gets close enough to see what it is, he stops where he is, he turns around, and he runs back down the hallway. He finds the nearest exit, he goes outside, and he calls the police. Back on January 6th, on the day that Bernard and Angela were supposed to meet up for lunch, Bernard did leave his daughter's house and he walked straight to the mall, and he got there. He arrived at the Westfield Center Mall and was picked up on camera walking into their food court. But the staff at the mall who reviewed the footage for police, they only looked at a handful of cameras. There's hundreds of cameras. They only looked at a couple, and so they missed this crucial footage of Bernard. And what the footage would have shown them was Bernard making his way into the food court ahead of Angela. Angela's nowhere to be found. And Bernard, instead of sitting down at their meeting spot in front of this restaurant, Bernard suddenly looks like he's confused, and he turns and he walks to this emergency exit door. He presses it in, he steps inside, and the door shuts behind him. Now, the Westfield Center Mall is not your average mall. It is massive. There are 6 floors to it, nearly 300 shops and restaurants, but what truly makes it massive is something that the public doesn't usually see. And that is, behind staff-only doors and emergency exit doors like the one Bernard had just gone through are nearly 8 miles of windowless concrete narrow stairwells and tunnels that loop all around the outside of the building. And once Bernard had gone through that emergency exit door and that door had shut and locked behind him, the only way for him to return to the food court and meet his wife would be if he completely exited the mall and looped all the way back around. But in order to exit the mall from where he just entered, he would need to go to a very specific exterior fire exit door that was several floors below him, and to get to it required following this very confusing signage on the walls. And so if you did it correctly, you would basically go down the hallway, find this particular stairwell, you'd go down a couple of levels, and then at some point, without really any signage, you would get to the appropriate floor and you'd go down the hallway into this maze of more hallways, and then finally you'd reach this kind of nondescript exit door, and that would be your exit. Finding your way from where Bernard entered all the way to the exit of the mall would be challenging for someone thinking clearly, and clearly Bernard was not. Bernard was confused and likely really didn't understand where he was or what he was doing or why he was there, and so he did not follow these directions. Instead, he just began wandering down the hallway, and he would have immediately passed the one stairwell that would have very circuitously brought him down but out of the building. He passed that stairwell, and he just kept on walking, and eventually he walked into this staff-only area, which was even more confusing because there was no signs telling him where to go, and virtually every door he encountered would have been locked. And so as Bernard wandered through this concrete maze and got more and more mixed up and confused, he most likely began yelling out for help. But his sound could not have penetrated the walls, which means the only people who could have heard his cries would have been people inside the hallway with him. And unfortunately, this section of tunnels that Bernard had found himself in was rarely, if ever, used by any of the staff. And to make matters worse, the mall security guards were supposed to come in and do regular checks of all these 8 miles of tunnels and stairwells, specifically to see if people got lost in them. But over time, the security guards kind of stopped doing that. And there were no security cameras inside of this particular segment of tunnels that Bernard found himself in, and there was no cell phone reception, so had he tried calling anyone, it wouldn't have worked. And so truly, Bernard was on his own. And so after several hours or days of Bernard aimlessly wandering around this maze, hitting dead end after dead end and reaching locked door after locked door, Bernard at some point turned a corner and looked down at the end of a hallway, and he saw there was a chair up against the side of the wall. And like he was programmed to do anytime he got confused, he rushed over to it and he sat down and he began waiting for a passerby to help him or his family to find him. But unfortunately, help never came, and he would eventually pass away on that chair. On January 27th, that maintenance worker, he discovered Bernard's body. Following his death, the Westfield Center Mall came out and said they made drastic changes to their security system and how they track people while they're on their property.
Whispers echo, a haunting sound. Layers of vocals floating in the air, lost in a moment without a care. Melodic waves of emotion, experimental synthwave devotion, classic crossover of styles untold. In this indie rock world we won't grow up.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to do the 5-star review button's eyeliner, but use a wide tip black Sharpie. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast